Thank you so much for joining me.
My pleasure.
I want to start with your report titled Genocide as Colonial Erasure. Can you take me through the title? What do you mean by genocide as colonial erasure?
This report cannot be read without having an idea of why I started investigating genocide. And I presented a report about that in March this year. So this is the second report about genocide that I present to the United Nations. And I had already concluded that there were reasonable grounds to believe that Israel had committed acts of genocide in Gaza. Then in this report, I felt compelled to explain why this genocide is happening and why the state intent, the state responsibility is so obvious and cannot be missed. Because not only this is the only way to stop it as soon as possible, but also to make sure that this is the lasting justice that is perpetrated against the Palestinian people.
As you said, this is your second sort of fulsome report. In the last year, in March of 2024, you concluded that there were reasonable grounds to believe that Israel had committed acts of genocide in Gaza. And this second report, when I was reading it, really focused on the totality of Israel's actions. Mm-hmm. And you referred to the genocide as a, quote, means to an end. Mm-hmm. How has Israel's genocide of the Palestinians progressed from your first report to the second?
It has intensified. The genocide has intensified, and in Gaza, I've analyzed patterns, massacres, attacks on civilians that have become more and more obvious. As the resistance in Gaza gets decimated, you can see that there are only civilians between the Israeli army and the Israeli army's objective, which is to take the land without the people. This is why I call it colonial erasure. And this is not something that started recently. This is something that has been building up. But then as of October 8th, it escalated into an unprecedented and determined destruction of the Palestinian people, which started in Gaza, but it's metastasizing to the rest of the occupied Palestinian territory.
Yeah, I want to come to the rest of the territories because your report also warns about this spread into the occupied West Bank and East Jerusalem. What are you seeing and hearing in that area that worries you the most?
It's the patterns, it's the similarity of the attacks against Palestinian civilians, the scale, the nature, the cruelty, the sadism, the dehumanization. But the attacks on civilian infrastructure, for example, destroying homes, shops, energy grid, sewage, and livelihood, hospitals. This is something that has happened both in the West Bank and Gaza, of course, much more lethal and destructive in Gaza. But the arrest and detention, mass arrest and detention, and brutalization of the Palestinians deprived of their liberty, and even the use of torture and rape, this is something that has concerned all Palestinians, both from Gaza and the West Bank. And also the taking of the land is the pattern that is identifiable both in the West Bank and East Jerusalem and the Gaza Strip.
Over your tenure as Special Rapporteur, you've continued to highlight impunity, the impunity with which Israel acts. And you make recommendations for how to hold Israel to account, particularly in your second report and in your first report. Have you seen any of these recommendations implemented? Has anything happened over the past year?
Yes and no, in the sense that I see an increasing number of countries joining South Africa in their in the case against Israel for breach of the Genocide Convention. I see countries suspending ties with Israel, particularly from the Global South, diplomatic, economic, and political ties. I see also in the West, in some countries like Spain, Ireland, Portugal, Belgium, there is an increasing realization that business as usual cannot continue. But still, it's very little. I wouldn't say late, because there are still Palestinian lives to be saved, and to stop the erasure of what remains of Palestine. But still, it's appalling that Israel has not been stopped yet, including after killing, maiming, injuring at least 155,000 people, killing 45,000, including 17,000 children. This is monstrous.
I want to move to Israel's own state structure and failures at stopping this genocide. One of the talking points that is often heard from the US State Department is that Israel has procedures and policies and to investigate itself, and that it's a democracy and that we need to allow these processes to play out. We also heard Israel's lawyers make such a claim at the ICJ, but in your report, you write, the state of Israel is predicated on the goal of Palestinian erasure. Its entire political system is directed towards that goal. State structures have historically architected the oppression of Palestinians. Now, its institutions, failing to function as a bulwark, are together advancing the course of the current catastrophe. Can you unpack that for me a little bit? In what way are Israel's own institutions advancing this genocide?
Look, again, to establish state intent, what has been done so far by the jurisprudence on other genocide cases is to determine whether there was individual responsibility, because if one state official commits genocide, this immediately reflects into state responsibility. But my point is that we cannot wait for a trial of perpetrators. That might not happen. I mean, we need to find prosecutors at the international level or domestic level eager to take the case, and it might not happen. And so genocide cannot be stopped or cannot be even seen. And this is what's happening in this case. But how can we not see the genocidal intent, the state responsibility in a state that not only when it was alerted that there was a risk of genocide, and certain members from the president of the state to the prime minister and a minister of defense, they were all named as having incited to commit genocide by the ICJ in January 2024. The judiciary should have been investigated, and it didn't do that. This is not the acts of individual members of the cabinet. What have other Israeli ministers done? What has the parliament done? So you see, not only there was nothing done to stop the acts of genocidal violence, but in fact there has been an enabling atmosphere that has even worsened the situation.
If we sort of move to the discussion of the G word, genocide, and how some are very reluctant to call this what it is, to use the right words. One of my genocide studies professors, Dr. Gregory Stanton, who runs Genocide Watch, the website, came up with these 10 stages of genocide, starting with classification and ending with denial. And from the first stage of classification to that last stage, at what point would you say Israel is in right now?
I don't think that there is one simple answer to this, in the sense that various parts of the state are committing genocide, boasting about it, concealing it. So there is no denial. There is camouflage. This is something so unique to Israel, because Israel is committing the acts of killing, infliction of conditions of life that would lead to the destruction of the people of the group in whole or in part. It's inflicting severe bodily or mental harm to to the Palestinians, but it's justifying it as legitimate self-defense against human animals, against terrorists. And Israel is creating, by this token, a world without civilians.
I want to come back to the occupied West Bank and UNRWA, which Israel recently officially sent a letter to the UN ending its agreement, which gave a deadline of like 3 months. This relationship between UNRWA and Israel is one that I think a lot of people don't quite understand, because one of the talking points that you often hear is, why do Palestinians have their own refugee agency? Why can't they have, be treated like other places or people? Can you briefly just explain the relationship between UNRWA and Israel and why UNRWA even exists?
UNRWA exists because the Palestinian refugee question, so there are 750,000 Palestinians who were displaced by Zionist militias at the creation of the State of Israel. They were kicked out of their homes. Their homes were often destroyed or soon to be given to others. And these people ended up in refugee camps. This happened before even the Refugee Convention was signed, was ratified. Therefore, there were other bodies of the United Nations that were created to take care of Palestinian refugees. Back then, 75 years ago, having ad hoc solutions to mass refugee crisis was normal. Then UNHCR came on board. But while UNRWA has remained as the main provider of assistance and relief to Palestinian refugees, the political dimension that was embodied by another agency, to which UNRWA was ancillary, the UN Conciliation Commission for Palestine, has been completely demoted from the discussion. The Palestinian refugees are suspended in a limbo, and it's not true that the UNRWA operates outside of the realm of international law, refugee law, by renovating the refugee status of the refugees. This is what happens, including within the scope of action of UNHCR. Protracted refugee situations translate into derivative refugee status, so for Palestinian refugees and also for 17 million refugees worldwide.
I sort of recently compared Israel in this way to like a dad who doesn't pay alimony, to his children. Because when I was reading about what UNRWA provides, so education, healthcare, all of this, is that not the responsibility of Israel as an occupying force?
As an occupying power? Well, the responsibility of Israel should be first and foremost to let the refugee return and return their properties, everything that is under the custodians that was created to recollect and to take control of everything that the Palestinians have left behind. But also, yes, of course, as an occupying power in the occupied Palestinian territory, although the occupation is unlawful and needs to be dismantled, but as long as it's there, Israel is obliged to observe international humanitarian law, which includes the provision of basic services, of fundamental services like education, health, to the occupied people. So if UNRWA doesn't do that, it will be the responsibility of Israel.
You spoke at the talk about the sort of unprecedented, not only rhetorical war Israel has waged against the UN, but actual physical war. 70% of structures demolished or bombed, hundreds of UN workers killed. And you followed that up with, invoking Article 6, suspending Israel as a member. Can you take me through what the process of that would actually be? Like how would the mechanics of that work? What is Article 6? How do you do it?
Article 6 concerns the possibility to suspend the credentials of UN member states, which is upon the General Assembly, generally after recommendations of the Security Council. Now, the Security Council might not make that recommendations, but this is one of those cases where I think the General Assembly should invoke, as it has been with Resolution 377, I think it's the number, Uniting for Peace, the capacity to advance towards solutions when there is an impasse at the UN Security Council level. And in any case, already having this discussion about suspending Israel is fundamental because it allows to expose the gravity of what Israel has been doing in the occupied Palestinian territory over the past 400 days.
I want to end with this. I have a lot more questions for you, but I don't, I don't want to take up more of your time. I want to ask you about comparison and then exceptionalism when it comes to genocide. From Rwanda to Cambodia to Myanmar to the Nazi genocide of the Jews and the Armenian genocide, which Germany also had a hand in, they all have common markers. How important is it to be able to make comparisons when you're trying to sort of map the way genocides work in order to stop them before they happen?
There are different layers of answers to this question, because certainly the possibility to assess that there are certain recurring patterns and events and certain stages. The fact that there are commonalities across the various genocides, no matter how specific then they are, because there is no one genocide that look like another. However, what this comparative assessment should lead to is the ability to prevent genocide. And here's where we continue to fail. The other thing is the fact that there is one common element always, it's dehumanization. When the dehumanization is so profound, so rooted, one group doesn't see the other as human. There is no possibility to save lives. And in fact, the fury of the genocidal power keeps on growing. It's like if there was if the executioners of the genocide were possessed. It's incredible. It's incredible how violent it is. But also, wait a second, because I forgot what I wanted to say. Just bear with me. What is interesting is to look at what stops genocide. And unfortunately, what is a recurrent pattern is external intervention, lacking which people are destined to be exterminated, genocided.
Last question. At your press conference in Ottawa, you mentioned how Canada is uncomfortable with the use of the word apartheid. Last month, I spoke with Palestinian lawyer Diana Boutou, and I asked her why she thinks, despite all the features and markers of an apartheid state, that governments avoid using the term. Why do you think people are so reluctant or hesitant to use that word?
Because apartheid is a crime, and recognizing it as a crime carries responsibilities. Responsibilities to stop it, not to engage with it, to take actions, including justice. And clearly this country is not ready to do that. Sad, but true.
And finally, in 20 to 30 years, Francesca, how do you think we'll look back on this time?
Despicable. Shameful. Thousands of children have been literally butchered by the Israeli army. And they've been posting about that like other genocidaires. This is what, the genocidaires document and almost take pleasure at inflicting enormous pain on a people.
You've used the word sadism a lot.
It's really sadistic what they do. And at the same time, this is televised. It goes on our mobile phones, and this is why I use the word I evoked Clockwork Orange. We are clockworked into acceptance of this repulsive repetition of history. And this is for me the failure of the international legal order. If we can't prevent genocide, if we can't prevent the extermination of a people, the destruction of a people, what remains to be said, to be used.
And yet there is this groundswell, a huge movement of solidarity that I've never seen. I mean, I was at this university in 2005, 2006. We brought Norman Finkelstein here, we brought Robert Fisk. But what these students did this year at this university is unprecedented. Yeah. What they did all over the world. So does that give you any hope?
Of course,
yeah.
Of course. I would be unfair and blind if I didn't recognize the immense work that has been done by these young people. And it's so infuriating to see how much risk they had to take. And the fact, where were their professors? Those teaching them about human rights and then not supporting them the moment that these young people take the street to try to protest in defense of a people which is being exterminated. And this is where you see that even in universities, which should be place for open debate and discussion, but again, where study and the formation of knowledge needs to be based on facts. Even here, there has been more space to fabrication of lies than the truth. The truth has been, as it often happens, one of the victims of this recent assault.
Yeah, the first victim. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
You're welcome. I'm sorry I have zero energy, but I'm a bit
Thank you.